Thursday, 7 January 1945, at 10 a.m. in the Ardennes region of Northern Europe during World War II, a press conference convened at the headquarters of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery quickly became one of the most controversial public moments of the Western Allied campaign. In this era of intense and brutal fighting, as snow still clung to the ground after the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery stepped before assembled correspondents and spoke about the progress of the counter-offensive launched to blunt the last great German thrust on the Western Front. What he said in the hours that followed would ignite a storm not only within Allied command rooms, but across political capitals from London to Washington. Montgomery was one of the most senior British commanders in World War II, a man whose reputation had been built on years of experience in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. He was equally known for his meticulous planning as he was for a personal style that many contemporaries described as self-assured and occasionally difficult. In the closing months of 1944, he had been temporarily assigned operational responsibility for part of the Allied line during the German Ardennes offensive, a role that placed him above two large American armies in one sector. The temporary arrangement, made amidst the chaos of battle, resolved an immediate command issue, but also brought underlying national sensitivities into sharper focus. At that 10 a.m. press conference on 7 January 1945, Montgomery addressed reporters about the northern flank of the counterattack. He spoke at length about the challenges faced in confronting the German offensive and the steps taken to secure Allied positions. But in framing his remarks, he described the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky he had ever handled, and suggested, implicitly if not literally, that British leadership had been decisive in stabilizing the situation. He spoke of British troops fighting on either side of American forces, who had taken a hard blow. Many American journalists and commanders interpreted the remarks as insinuations that American units had failed or been less effective than their British counterparts during the crisis. The controversy that followed was immediate and intense. American press outlets seized upon portions of Montgomery's comments, some of which were amplified or rephrased by reporters in ways that made them appear overtly disparaging. Although Montgomery never used the word useless in publicly recorded statements, the tone perceived by American audiences was enough to provoke outrage among military leaders and the wider public. Newspapers carried headlines suggesting that a senior British commander had belittled the value of American soldiers at a time when tens of thousands had fought and died in the Ardennes winter. The reaction among American commanders was especially swift and heated. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, formally referred to Montgomery's remarks as mischaracterizing the American role and insisted that the truth of events be presented accurately to the press and public. Bradley's own press briefing made clear that Montgomery's expanded operational role during the battle was always intended to be temporary, and that American troops had fought with great bravery and determination in conditions that were among the worst of the European campaign. These dual press briefings, Montgomery's and Bradley's, fueled tensions between British and American circles at a moment when Allied unity was crucial. Behind the scenes, the controversy extended beyond journalists and frontline military commanders to the highest levels of political leadership. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister and one of the most influential figures of World War II, watched with concern as reports of the dispute made their way to London. Churchill knew that maintaining Allied cohesion was not only a political necessity, but a strategic one. The Anglo-American special relationship had formed the backbone of the effort to defeat Nazi Germany, and any rupture in that alliance could have far-reaching consequences on and beyond the battlefield. From early in the war, Churchill had placed great emphasis on forging a partnership with the United States. He saw American industrial power and manpower as essential to defeating the Axis, and he worked tirelessly to cultivate trust with President Franklin Roosevelt and his senior commanders. Churchill first used the phrase special relationship to describe this linkage as early as February 1944, and he continued to stress its importance through the remainder of World War II and into the early post-war era. He understood the mutual dependency of British and American war aims, but also appreciated the cultural and institutional sensitivities inherent in any coalition. Churchill's reaction to the Montgomery controversy was shaped by this broader strategic framework. London received reports of growing disquiet over the press conference and its fallout. Although Montgomery continued to support among some British political and media circles, Churchill recognized that any perceived insult to American soldiers, particularly at a time when U.S. forces had borne staggering casualties since Normandy, could do real damage to Allied morale and cooperation. Churchill was not inclined to dismiss Montgomery's military accomplishments, but he was keenly aware that language and impression mattered as much as troop movements and strategic victory. Historians note that Churchill's response was one of pragmatic statesmanship rather than dramatic confrontation. He did not publicly rebuke Montgomery in harsh terms, nor did he allow the episode to fester in headline news for weeks. Instead, Churchill took steps through diplomatic channels to reassure American leaders, both military and civilian, that Britain valued the courage and performance of American forces. He emphasized in private communications that Montgomery's remarks, however unfortunate in tone, did not reflect official British policy or judgment about American contributions to the war effort. Churchill's messaging made clear that any suggestion that American troops were less capable or less brave was not endorsed by British leadership.
Churchill's diplomatic efforts were effective, in part because of his long-standing awareness of the mutual pressures borne by Allied commanders in World War II. He knew that wartime conditions created intense stress, and he understood that Montgomery's personal style, strong, confident to the point of brusqueness, sometimes led him into trouble when addressing multinational audiences. Indeed, Montgomery himself later admitted regret about the press conference, acknowledging that whatever he said would likely be seen as controversial given the already strained feelings between American and British commanders. It is important to clarify that Montgomery's remarks did not occur in a vacuum. The context was one of profound exhaustion and loss for American troops in the Ardennes, where they had fought in freezing weather with limited supplies and against a determined German offensive. The German thrust had surprised Allied planners, and American units had absorbed heavy casualties before the overall counterattack regained momentum. Against this backdrop, any implication that U.S. troops had failed or been ineffective touched deep nerves in the American military community. Montgomery's press comments, whether intended to highlight British achievements or not, struck a chord that risked overshadowing a hard-won collective effort. Churchill's preferred course of action was not to inflame the situation, but to steady it. He communicated directly and privately with senior American figures, among them President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower, to underscore that the British government appreciated the deep sacrifices made by American forces. Churchill's personal affection for American soldiers was well documented in private correspondence. He frequently praised their energy, resilience, and industrial strength, and worked to keep U.S.-British cooperation at the forefront of Allied strategy. One of the key elements of Churchill's response was to remind Montgomery and those around him that language mattered in coalition warfare. Churchill's intervention was both a reflection of political realism and an expression of personal respect for the American role in World War II. He wanted to ensure that disputes between Allied commanders did not evolve into diplomatic rifts, and he made clear that British admiration for American combat performance was genuine and strategic, not merely polite rhetoric. Churchill also had to balance these private interventions with the realities of domestic politics in Britain. Montgomery remained a popular figure among many in the British public and media, celebrated for earlier victories such as El Alamein and his leadership during challenging phases of the Italian campaign. Churchill understood that openly reprimanding a senior and widely respected British commander could be politically unpopular at home, particularly at a moment when British forces were still engaged on multiple fronts. Churchill's skill lay in navigating these realities with a steady hand, defending alliance unity without diminishing the contributions of his own army or its leaders. In the weeks that followed the press controversy, the broader strategic campaign in Western Europe continued. Montgomery's role in the Ardennes crisis remained a subject of debate among historians, but the focus quickly shifted back to operational plans for crossing the Rhine and pushing deeper into Germany. German and British armies fought side by side in subsequent operations, reflecting the sustained importance of cooperation, even amid occasional diplomatic friction. Churchill's broader leadership ensured that moments of disagreement did not spiral into permanent divisions. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward final victory in Europe, the memory of Montgomery's press remarks remained a footnote compared with the magnitude of shared sacrifice. Churchill continued to emphasize in speeches and private counsel that the Allied partnership with the United States was not only strategically essential, but a defining feature of World War II. Churchill recognized that unity had been forged not through uniformity of opinion, but through an ability to absorb differences without fracturing the coalition. Looking back from a historical perspective, the episode reveals the fragility and strength of coalition leadership under the immense pressures of World War II. Montgomery's inadvertent diplomatic misstep could have threatened to weaken Allied solidarity, but the measured political response led by Churchill helped diffuse the controversy and preserve the strategic alignment upon which success depended. When reports of Montgomery's remarks about American soldiers reached Winston Churchill, his response was rooted in political acumen, alliance stewardship, and personal belief in the indispensability of U.S.-British cooperation during World War II. He worked to reassure American leaders, defend the dignity of Allied soldiers, and temper personal pride with diplomatic tact. Churchill recognized that in a coalition war, words could be as consequential as weapons, and that sustaining unity among nations was essential to winning the larger struggle against Nazi Germany. As the political dust of January 1945 continued to settle over Allied headquarters during World War II, the deeper significance of Churchill's response began to reveal itself not merely in the tone of his communications, but in the quiet recalibration of relationships among senior commanders on both sides of the Atlantic. Churchill understood that the words attributed to Montgomery, whether born of blunt military analysis or personal pride, could not be allowed to define the cooperative spirit upon which the Allied campaign depended. His approach in the days and weeks following the controversy reflected a deliberate effort to shift attention away from personality and toward shared purpose, reinforcing the message that the achievements of the Allied armies were collective rather than competitive. Within British political and military circles, Churchill carried out this balancing act with characteristic subtlety.
He did not shield Montgomery entirely from criticism, but neither did he sacrifice him to international outrage. Instead, he framed the episode as an unfortunate misunderstanding amplified by wartime pressures and the complexities of multinational command. He emphasized privately that Montgomery had played a key role in helping stabilize portions of the northern sector during the Ardennes crisis, while also making clear that such efforts could not be interpreted as diminishing the immense courage and resilience demonstrated by American soldiers in the same campaign. In doing so, Churchill preserved both the dignity of his own commander and the honor of his American allies.
At the same time, Churchill drew important lessons from the episode about the nature of communication in coalition warfare. He recognized that military commanders were not simply battlefield technicians. They were public figures whose statements could resonate far beyond the operational zones in which they were made. In meetings with advisors and senior officials, Churchill stressed the need for careful phrasing, measured tone, and awareness of how national audiences might interpret even factual military commentary. His reflections on the controversy underscored his belief that leadership in World War II extended beyond issuing orders. It required an understanding of morale, perception, and the emotional weight of language at a time when millions of families followed news of the war with anxiety and pride. Among American leaders, Churchill's calm reassurance gradually eased the anger that had surged in the wake of the press reports. His respectful acknowledgement of American sacrifice helped reaffirm a sense of mutual trust. Rather than allowing resentment to harden into hostility, Churchill worked patiently to restore confidence, and his sincerity carried weight precisely because it reflected long-standing convictions rather than convenient diplomacy. He had consistently praised American energy, industrial power, and fighting spirit since the earliest phases of the conflict, and his reaffirmation of these sentiments in early 1945 felt both authentic and strategically grounded. This cooperative equilibrium was especially important because the Allied campaign was entering its decisive phase. Preparations were already underway for renewed offensives across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. Churchill knew that these final operations would require seamless coordination among commanders, integrated logistical planning, and a unified sense of purpose among troops drawn from multiple nations. Any lingering division born from accusations or wounded pride could risk undermining operational efficiency at a moment when clarity and unity were indispensable. His intervention, therefore, was not only diplomatic but profoundly strategic. From an educational standpoint, this moment during World War II offers a powerful case study in alliance management under extreme pressure. Students of history can see clearly how political leadership intersects with military command, and how the success of multinational coalitions depends as much on interpersonal diplomacy as on tactical brilliance. The controversy surrounding Montgomery's remarks and Churchill's subsequent handling of the matter reveals the delicate architecture of trust that sustains wartime cooperation. It illustrates how disagreements, when managed with restraint and perspective, can be transformed from points of fracture into opportunities for strengthening mutual respect. Churchill's approach also reflected his lifelong understanding of history and human character. He knew that future generations would examine not only the outcome of battles, but the behavior of leaders responsible for guiding their nations through them. In correspondence and cabinet discussions, he frequently referred to the idea that the Allied story must be told as one of shared struggle and shared triumph. He believed that the narrative of World War II should not dissolve into national competition over credit or prestige, but instead stand as a testament to what could be achieved when free nations acted in unity against tyranny.
In the months that followed, as Allied armies advanced deeper into German territory, Churchill's steady diplomacy helped ensure that cooperation remained firm. British and American soldiers continued to fight side by side, their collective achievements gradually overwhelming the remaining resistance of the German military. While strategic debates and personal differences among commanders never fully disappeared, the larger sense of partnership endured. Churchill's earlier decision to intervene thoughtfully in the Montgomery controversy thus contributed to the preservation of that fragile yet powerful alliance spirit. From a broader historical perspective, this episode reminds us that the realities of World War II were not shaped solely by battlefield maneuvers or military hardware. They were shaped by words spoken at press conferences, written in telegrams, exchanged in private meetings, and echoed across continents. Words had the power to wound pride, to stir resentment, or to strengthen unity. Churchill, more than most statesmen of his era, understood the weight of language, and he used that awareness to help guide his coalition through one of its most sensitive moments. In reflecting on what Churchill said, and more importantly, how he responded when confronted with claims that Montgomery had disparaged American soldiers, we gain insight into the moral and political foundations of Allied success. Churchill chose not to escalate division, not to allow anger to define relationships, and not to frame the controversy as a contest of national valor. Instead, he emphasized shared sacrifice, reaffirmed respect, and placed unity above ego. His reaction serves as an enduring lesson in leadership that even amid conflict, restraint and empathy can hold together the partnerships upon which victory depends. As the war moved towards its closing chapters and the Allied cause edged ever closer to final victory, Churchill's handling of this episode became part of the larger fabric of wartime governance. It symbolized his belief that the story of World War II should be written not in the language of rivalry, but in the language of cooperation and resolve. For historians, educators, and students alike, it stands as a reminder that behind every major military campaign lies a complex human drama, one in which choices of tone, judgment, and respect can shape the course of history as profoundly as any movement of armies across a map.
On 3 January 1944, in the thick of World War II, the Allied command structure in Europe was still evolving into the combined coalition machine that would eventually carry the invasion of Western Europe to success. The tensions between national commanders, however, were not abstract or imagined. They were recorded in memoranda, telegrams, and private conversations that revealed how fragile unity could be beneath the official language of partnership. In this climate, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, sent private communications that criticized the effectiveness of certain American formations. His wording, sharp and dismissive, reflected both his uncompromising view of military discipline and his belief that British doctrine represented a superior professional standard forged through earlier years of the war in North Africa and the Mediterranean. These criticisms did not occur in a vacuum. By early 1944, American forces had already suffered painful learning experiences in Tunisia, at Kasserine Pass, and in the costly campaigns in Sicily and Italy. Many U.S. divisions had been rapidly expanded from a peacetime army into a massive wartime force, and their commanders were learning under fire. British officers who had been at war since 1939 sometimes concluded that their American counterparts lacked experience or cohesion. Montgomery's private telegrams reflected this attitude, using harsh language that reduced complex realities to blunt judgments. The language carried risk. If circulated widely, it could threaten morale and strain alliance trust at the very moment when cooperation was essential. Winston Churchill, serving as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, understood the stakes. His experience as a statesman and war leader had taught him that military success in World War II depended on preserving unity between Britain and the United States. Churchill had witnessed disagreements over strategic priorities before, debates about Mediterranean operations, the timing of cross-channel invasion, and the allocation of landing craft, and he knew that political leadership had to restrain personal rivalries. When Montgomery's private remarks came to his attention, Churchill recognized that such statements, if allowed to stand unchallenged, could undermine the political and psychological foundation of the Allied partnership. Churchill's response was guided by a careful balance of discipline and diplomacy. He valued Montgomery's operational skill and the morale he inspired in British troops, but he would not permit public or private disparagement of American soldiers to influence official attitudes. The Prime Minister emphasized that American formations were improving rapidly, that they had demonstrated courage and adaptability, and that their industrial power and manpower reserves made them indispensable to the coming invasion of Western Europe. Churchill also understood that American public opinion closely followed how British leaders perceived their forces, and any insult could echo far beyond military headquarters. In his reply, Churchill asserted that American soldiers were not to be described in such terms, either formally or informally. He reminded Montgomery that coalition warfare demanded respect as well as professionalism, and that morale, confidence, and mutual trust were combat resources as vital as tanks and artillery. His message was not merely administrative, it was an act of political leadership designed to prevent friction from eroding operational cooperation. Churchill reaffirmed that the combined Anglo-American force would fight as equals with shared burdens and shared honor, and he insisted that British commanders recognize the strategic consequences of their words. The context of this exchange highlights a core reality of World War II coalition warfare. Success required more than strategy and logistics, it required emotional intelligence at the highest levels of command. The war effort brought together distinct military cultures, doctrinal traditions, and personal egos. The United States favored decentralized initiative and rapid operational tempo, while the British tended toward methodical planning shaped by years of attrition. Misunderstandings were inevitable. Churchill's intervention helped ensure those disagreements did not transform into structural resentment or operational fracture. As operations progressed through 1944, American forces demonstrated increasing effectiveness. Their performance in the Normandy landings, the breakout from the Bocage, and the liberation of France reflected growth in leadership, coordination, and combat experience. British and American units fought side by side under shared hardships and shared triumphs. Churchill's insistence on respect between allies helped reinforce a sense of common purpose, which proved essential when setbacks, such as the heavy casualties at Omaha Beach or the shock of the Ardennes offensive, tested Allied resolve. Montgomery himself would later cooperate closely with American commanders, including General Eisenhower, who served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Though disagreements continued at times, the alliance endured because its leaders understood that victory in World War II depended on unity rather than rivalry. Churchill's reaction to Montgomery's harsh private remarks was part of this broader effort to keep the coalition intact. By challenging dismissive language and defending the contribution of American soldiers, Churchill reinforced the political foundation on which the military partnership rested. This episode remains significant in the historical study of World War II because it illustrates how leadership decisions extended beyond battlefield maneuvers. The conflict was fought by millions of soldiers, but it was also shaped by the judgments of a small number of individuals at the summit of power. Churchill's handling of Montgomery's telegrams demonstrated strategic awareness of alliance psychology. His words reminded commanders that every communication, even a private one, had the potential to influence morale, mutual respect, and ultimately the effectiveness of combined operations. In the end, the success of the Allied campaign in Western Europe was not the product of a single doctrine, nation, or general. It was the result of coordinated effort, shared sacrifice, and continual adjustment to lessons learned under fire. The story of Churchill's response to Montgomery's criticism underscores how political leadership protected that unity at critical moments. It shows that in World War II, victory required not only weapons and planning, but a conscious commitment to partnership, a commitment preserved through firm, measured, and historically consequential words. As winter turned into spring in 1944, the Allied High Command continued to prepare for the decisive operation that would define the Western Front of World War II, the invasion of Normandy. The need for cohesion between British and American forces became even more critical as planning intensified under the overall leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Churchill, fully aware of the political weight behind every operational decision, maintained his insistence that Allied unity required not only cooperation in planning and logistics, but also restraint in criticism and humility among senior commanders. The earlier episode, involving Montgomery's dismissive language toward American soldiers, remained a cautionary reminder of how fragile respect could be if leaders failed to recognize the broader implications of their private communications. During this period, the American Army continued to expand its combat experience and professionalism. Units that had once been criticized for inexperience were undergoing rigorous training, integrating battlefield lessons from North Africa and Italy, and refining coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Senior American officers placed strong emphasis on adaptability and learning from mistakes, and this process produced measurable improvements in operational performance. Churchill recognized that these developments strengthened the Allied position as a whole. He viewed American resilience and willingness to evolve under pressure as qualities that would prove decisive once the campaign in Western Europe began in earnest. Churchill also maintained close communication with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, reinforcing the diplomatic foundation of the Anglo-American partnership. Their correspondence and conferences underscored the shared purpose of defeating Nazi Germany while managing the inevitable frictions of coalition warfare. Churchill knew that political confidence between London and Washington had to be mirrored by mutual respect among field commanders. For this reason, he continued to discourage derogatory remarks, sweeping generalizations, and nationalist rivalries within military channels. His leadership style combined strategic calculation with an understanding of morale, not only the morale of soldiers in the field, but also that of entire nations watching the progress of the war. In this climate, Montgomery adjusted his tone, remaining firm in his professional standards, while acknowledging, at least in practice, the vital role of American power in the coming operations. He continued to emphasize discipline, control, and methodical execution, characteristics he believed were necessary to avoid unnecessary casualties based on his earlier campaigns. At the same time, American commanders demonstrated increased confidence, logistical strength, and tactical initiative. Churchill viewed these complementary strengths as assets rather than points of competition. His earlier intervention had helped set a boundary that prevented internal criticism from shaping operational cooperation. When the Normandy landings were launched on June 6, 1944, the outcome of those earlier political and interpersonal efforts became evident. British, American, and Canadian forces conducted one of the largest amphibious assaults in history, facing strong resistance, difficult terrain, and complex logistical challenges. American troops at Omaha and Utah Beach endured severe casualties, yet persisted with determination and adaptability. Their performance contradicted any lingering doubts about their effectiveness and reinforced Churchill's conviction that disparaging judgments had never reflected the broader reality of American capability in World War II. As the campaign in Normandy continued through June and July, Allied forces confronted the dense hedgerow landscape of the French bocage, which slowed maneuver and complicated offensive operations. American units, supported by engineers and armor, gradually developed new tactics for hedgerow fighting, integrating artillery coordination and close support techniques. Churchill followed these developments closely, recognizing them as further evidence of a rapidly maturing combat force. He continued to stress, in discussions with British leaders and military staff, that Allied victory depended on acknowledging and valuing the contributions of every partner on the battlefield. Montgomery's command responsibilities during this phase also placed him in close operational contact with American formations. He oversaw multinational coordination while directing British and Canadian efforts on the eastern sector of the front. Although disagreements over tempo and operational emphasis occasionally resurfaced, the coalition framework remained intact. Churchill's earlier insistence on respect and unity had helped establish a climate in which disputes could be managed without fracturing cooperation. His intervention had not eliminated personal rivalry, but it had set limits on how far criticism could extend before threatening strategic cohesion.
The Allied breakout from Normandy in late July and August 1944 further demonstrated the transformation of the American Army into a highly effective offensive force. Operations such as Cobra opened the way for rapid advances across France, while British and Canadian forces fixed and contained major German formations elsewhere along the front. Churchill viewed this complementary relationship as proof that coalition warfare drew strength from diversity of doctrine and method. Where one force excelled in attritional holding operations, another could deliver rapid exploitation. The key, in his view, was maintaining trust rather than allowing pride or resentment to distort judgment. Throughout the remainder of 1944, Churchill continued to monitor relations between his commanders and their American counterparts. He maintained his position that respect was a strategic necessity rather than a courtesy. The earlier incident involving Montgomery's harsh private telegrams remained part of the internal record, an example frequently cited by historians to illustrate the constant balancing act required to preserve alliance unity in World War II. Churchill's response reflected his belief that words spoken in confidence could still shape attitudes, influence decisions, and affect how armies perceived one another in the field. As the Allies confronted new challenges, including the prolonged fighting in the Low Countries and the shock of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, cooperation between British and American forces once again became a test of discipline, confidence, and shared purpose. American units bore the brunt of the initial German assault during the Battle of the Bulge, enduring severe pressure and high casualties. British reinforcements moved to support the defense, and coordination between national commands became essential. Churchill's earlier insistence on mutual respect strengthened the ability of the coalition to respond without allowing earlier tensions to widen into mistrust. By the time Allied armies crossed the Rhine in 1945, the professional relationship between British and American forces had matured into a working partnership shaped by experience, shared sacrifice, and constant negotiation. Churchill's handling of Montgomery's criticism was one among many moments in which political leadership shaped the moral and psychological framework of coalition warfare. The episode stands as a case study in how expressions of judgment, particularly from senior commanders, can either undermine or reinforce alliance cohesion during periods of intense military pressure. From a historical perspective, this incident underscores the importance of diplomatic awareness within military leadership.
Coalition warfare in World War II required more than operational competence. It required sensitivity to national pride, battlefield identity, and the symbolic significance of how one army perceived another. Churchill recognized that American soldiers were fighting not only as allies, but as representatives of a nation whose industrial and military strength would help determine the final outcome of the war. His firm but measured response to Montgomery affirmed that their contribution was essential and deserving of respect. The broader lesson derived from this episode is that military success in World War II was inseparable from political guidance. Churchill's ability to balance critique, encouragement, and strategic perspective helped maintain unity during moments of tension. His words served as a reminder that victory depended on cooperation, grounded in professionalism and mutual recognition. The Allied coalition did not function without friction, but it endured because leaders like Churchill worked to prevent criticism from hardening into division. In the final months of the war in Europe, as German resistance collapsed and Allied forces advanced towards victory, the long and often complex partnership between Britain and the United States stood as a defining feature of the conflict. The earlier controversy surrounding Montgomery's remarks faded into the wider historical narrative, but it retained significance for scholars studying the human dimensions of coalition command. It revealed the pressures, personalities, and judgments that existed behind formal statements and public unity, and it demonstrated how political leadership intervened when private opinions threatened broader strategic objectives. Churchill's response, grounded in respect for American soldiers and awareness of alliance dynamics, helped reinforce the moral foundation of the Anglo-American partnership at a critical time in World War II. It exemplified the role of statesmanship within wartime leadership, a role that extended beyond speeches and strategy into the careful management of words, attitudes, and relationships among those responsible for directing millions of troops. Through his intervention, Churchill preserved not only unity of command, but also unity of purpose, ensuring that the coalition would move forward towards a shared victory shaped by cooperation rather than rivalry.